This is a video about the myth of the agricultural revolution. Good morning, this is Chris speaking. Wake Up with a video about myths of human history, myths of humanity, part 1, the myth of the agricultural revolution. We are being taught nowadays that a few thousand years ago, depending of the culture, 1,000, 2,000, 4,000, 8,000, 10,000 years ago, city building and agriculture started, and before that, humanity was living in poverty and squalor, didn't have enough to eat. You had to forage every day, from morning to evening, for food, and sometimes you were going hungry. And everything was just really hard, and the only thought in the human mind was survival. There was no culture, no intelligence. All the energy was going into hunting and gathering, and maybe in some more advanced cultures into nomad husbandry of goats and sheep and stuff. But life was really hard until some people started with large-scale agriculture and city building. And then certain grasses from the wheat family were cultivated, and suddenly there was enough to eat for everyone. And because of that, people were able to think about other things, and culture started, and art, and scholarship, trade, religions, and more and more luxury was possible, culminating in the nowadays overfilled supermarkets where you can buy everything every day, any time of the year. In some countries, any time of the day or night. So that now you can use your time for whatever you want. You don't have to hunt for food anymore. If you're hungry, you just go to a supermarket or a bakery or any kind of shop, and you can buy whatever you want anytime. No more starvation, no more lack of anything, no more survival problems of any kind. All the basic needs of Maslow's pyramids are easily covered, very safe. This, my friends, is a myth. It's just plainly not true. First of all, this level of luxury that we have nowadays in some countries is not accessible to everyone. It's not accessible to the majority of the human population of Earth. And more importantly, the whole premise of how it all started is completely wrong. It's upside down. It's propaganda, brainwashing. 20 years ago, I studied cultural anthropology in university, and there I learned that actually indigenous people don't have any trouble finding food in their natural environment. They don't have any trouble hunting. They have small gardens where they grow everything they need. They have no problems fishing. They spend about 5 hours every day on gathering food, preparing food, and any other adjacent activities like flaying and tanning and so on. There's no lack of food because it's growing everywhere. If you go into the jungle, food is growing everywhere. The rivers are full of fish, the trees are full of animals, and some plants like manioc, like cassava, it's very easy. You dig out a few roots and you leave a few pieces, put them in the earth again, and a few weeks later you have fully grown roots again. There's actually no lack of anything, least of all of food. Now, to afford this level of luxury we have nowadays, most people have to work at least 8 hours every day. And if we look at the Middle Ages and before, peasants, they had to work 10, 12, 14 hours every day. And even nowadays, ask any farmer how much he or she is working every day. It's a lot. Well, if you ask a small-scale gardener or farmer who produces enough food for a club of, let's say, 70 or 100 people, he doesn't have to work 8 or 10 hours. He has to work every day, and it depends on the time of the year. But there's time for other stuff. So it is true that in these ancient pre-civilization cultures, they didn't have writing. They passed on their knowledge and their history by storytelling. So they didn't have writing, and maybe they didn't have mathematics, but otherwise they had everything. And they were certainly not dumb or stupid or primitive or anything. Plus, they were more in tune with nature and the world. And in most cases more happy. There were some warlike tribes that basically annihilated each other, but otherwise tribes are around 100 people, and they have a certain area in which they can live. And now and then there's a little bit of a discussion with neighbors about boundaries, but no real annihilation, full-scale war. The truth about the agricultural revolution is that it was necessary to afford full-scale war. If you have a war of annihilation and conquering, you need to supply troops. And for this you need more food than is necessary on a day-to-day basis. You need storages of food. So the very first expansive cultures like the Sumerians and the Hittites and the Egyptians and whatnot, all these cultures, mostly in the Middle East and some of them in other parts like in China along the Yellow River and so on, or in ancient Khorasan, they started building cities. So they needed more food because more people were living in these cities than it was possible to generate food for in your garden. But once they found out that they could produce as much food as they wanted, and population growth was setting in, because if there's more food, there's more population, and then you have more soldiers. And you need more and more land to feed your people, so you need to expand, and expansion is only possible by stealing land from others, by subjugating others, or killing others, or driving others away. But if all your neighbors are consisting of tribes of 100 or maybe of 200 people, and you come with a few thousand soldiers and enough supply line of food, it's no problem. You will always win the war. Plus your neighbors who are now your enemies, they don't expect you to wage a full-scale war because nothing like that has ever happened in history. It was always a more or less violent discussion about keeping the traditional boundaries. Once you want to invade someone else's land, you have to wage war, but this was very, very rare. But now, for some cultures, it was commonplace. They always waged war. They always said, either you assimilate or we will destroy you, like the Borg in Star Trek. And only then, in these new cities, squalor and poverty started. And new diseases came up, and hygiene problems. And some people were rich and some people were poor, and kings came up. People who said that they were worth more than everyone else, and they had the say, and everyone had to do their bidding, which is, in Spiral Dynamics language, red. And it's the same nowadays. The kings are called presidents, or they are the heads of multinational companies. It's still red. In these 10,000 years, nothing much has changed. A minority possesses the majority of wealth and goods and real estate of humanity. And everyone else is working for them. You're not working for you so that you have enough to eat. No, you're working for them, and to ameliorate you, to placate you for your work, you get to enjoy some luxuries. How many people do you know who are really happy nowadays? Of course, you're happy when you buy something new, when you get your next fix, but otherwise, how many people do you know who are genuinely happy with their life and their work and so on? Not very many, probably. But if you talk to people in indigenous tribes that have little contact to so-called civilization, they're quite happy. They're quite content. They don't have big problems, and it's not a matter of intelligence here. They're very intelligent. They're happy because they're not alienated from the human nature, and they're not alienated from nature in general. But as soon as you take their land away and put them in some kind of hall in a city, then poverty and squalor starts, like in every of these so-called reservations. Then poverty and squalor starts, and alcoholism and whatnot, all kinds of addictions and depressions. Right now, depression is one of the top diseases of our civilization, because we're not following the law of life, we're not following the laws of nature, we're not following the laws of our own human nature. We're following a red culture of aggression and suppression. The one and only purpose of the agricultural revolution was and is to be able to wage war. It's not to get rid of starvation and poverty, because there was no starvation and poverty before the agricultural revolution. At least not in the tropics. Of course, once people were wandering off and exploring other countries and other climates, this could happen. Very good example were the Vikings. They were living in the north, in Sweden and Norway, and there was most of the year there was winter, so they really had trouble to get enough food. Or in the case of the Sahara, when the Sahara jungle turned into a Sahara desert, people had to run away and look for new lands, of course. And it's difficult to think of an alternative, mainly because we are so used to luxury. We're addicted to luxury, which is the only reward for our psychological suffering that we go through because we're living a life that is very, very strange. And we will talk in other videos about how the Industrial Revolution and the Digital Revolution also didn't solve the problem, but rather compounded. Technology will not be our savior, for the same reason that agriculture was not our savior. And there are alternatives. We don't have to go back to live in tribes of 100 people and forage for food in the rainforest and stuff. And also we cannot. Right now we destroyed so much of our environment that right now, of course, 8-9 billion people, they can't live from the rainforest. So we could use the best of both worlds. We tried out two worlds now in human history for many, many hundreds of thousands of years. We tried out the hunter and gatherer way and the nomad way. And for a few thousand years now we tried out the expansionist red culture, started with the agricultural revolution. But those are just two possible ways, or three possible ways. They're not the only ones. And definitely our way right now is not the only one. And it's not a progress. It's not some kind of human evolution, that what we have now is better than what we had 10,000 or 100,000 or 1 million years ago. It's just a different way, and let's be honest, it really doesn't seem to work too well. It's based on inequality and exploitation, blackmail and war. And it's also a breeding ground for criminality. In so-called indigenous tribes, you don't have criminality. And if you have, there are very effective ways to deal with it. You don't need prisons. Criminality only comes up in city culture, where people are alienated from their own nature, or where people are forced to steal so as not to starve. And in this city culture that we're living now today, most of the human beings, even psychopathy is fostered. If you're a psychopath nowadays, it's very easy to get a job in the business world or in politics. You will be rewarded constantly for antisocial behavior because the whole society is antisocial. So at some point we have to find a new way, because this way is not working, and to the old way no one wants to return. But first it is necessary for a large portion of the population to recognize that what we're living now is not progress. It's not the culmination or pinnacle of human evolution. It's a cul-de-sac. It's a sinking ship. And the grandiose agricultural revolution was not a revolution or an evolution. It was a devolution, an abomination. Because its main purpose was war, not feeding people but killing people, or enslaving and exploiting people. Now, the whole idea of slavery is very much linked to the agricultural revolution. You need some idiots who are doing the work for you, if they want it or not. And when this was not working anymore in Europe, for example, colonialism happened, was invented to subdue other people to do their work for them. Slavery was reintroduced in the Americas, for example. But most importantly, the indigenous cultures, the living example that another way of life is possible and maybe equally good or even better, had to be eradicated. The indigenous cultures had to be destroyed or vilified. They had to be projected as primitive people who were living in mud, in poverty, in despicable life circumstances. Stupid, primitive. Like animals, or worse than animals. So that no one would develop any interest in trying out their way of life. They were mischaracterized as subhuman artifacts from a dark past where no one wants to go back to. It's all just propaganda. Nothing of this is true. Propaganda was not invented in the 20th century. Propaganda was invented together with the city building, agricultural, aggressive, warlike societies 10,000, 8,000, 6,000 and whatever years ago. And before that, humanity was living in peace, mostly. It wasn't easy as well. Life on this planet is not easy for some reason, but it wasn't horrible either. And there were definitely less problems like we have nowadays. There was no poison in the water and the air and the earth, for example. Healthy organic food was the normal food. Nowadays it's hard to get and you have to pay 3 or 4 times as much. How's that progress? And to be able to pay for it, you have to work your ass off with some job that most people don't even like and which makes them depressive. So let this sink in. There will be resistance against it because you've been brainwashed, and our ancestors have been brainwashed for thousands of years. And this is the exact opposite what has been taught at schools for hundreds of years in order to enslave you. But the funny thing is there's no conspiracy behind it. There's no secret government who is directing all this. No, we are each other's keepers. We're all imprisoned in some weird, nightmarish concentration camp, and we are each other's keepers. We make sure that no one leaves the sinking ship. We prefer to perish together than to try out another way, with the reasoning that if we leave this way, what would follow would be poverty and squalor, which is the exact opposite. Now what we have is poverty and squalor for most people, and what indigenous tribes had and have in their natural environment is not poverty and squalor. So again, I'm not saying we should all go back to tribal life, but there are other possibilities that have been tried out even already. But those cultures were also subdued by the European conquerors and destroyed, or almost destroyed. One of the few cultures who tried out another way was the Kogi, or what are now the Kogi, which is only a very small proportion of those who have survived the mutilation and annihilation of the conquistadores. But they're very willing to tell us what to do now. They have a way out, but no one wants to listen because we think, well, they are just some primitives living in huts in the forest. What could they possibly tell us? And even in the spiritual world, there are people who are interested in awakening enlightenment. Even they don't listen to those people because they think, well, it's all an illusion anyway. As long as you're living a luxurious life, you can pretend that this is all an illusion. Because once you get shot or raped in the streets at night or imprisoned for something that you didn't do, carried off to some kind of concentration camp and getting tortures, then please repeat that this is all an illusion. Then I would like to see how equanimous you remain. Yes, much of what we perceive is an illusion, but these beliefs and belief set and conditionings and propagandas, they are part of it. Part of the illusion is that we think that the last 10,000 years was an upwards evolution of human consciousness. Well, in actual fact, nothing happened. There are more human beings now, but there's also more poverty, more criminality, more injustice, and so on. Because we are living in a self-made prison, voluntarily celebrating every day how grand it is. And if anyone comes along and tells us, well, that there is another way, then we say, well, how can that be? This is the pinnacle of human evolution. How can there be a better way? Of course, it will be better in a few decades or a few hundred years when technology has saved us. But a completely different way, impossible. So we close our ears and eyes and flee either into the delusional hope that technology will be our savior, or the delusional hope that enlightenment will be our savior, and at some point the whole of humanity will suddenly wake up or be saved by Jesus Christ or whatever. Both of it is very childish, magical thinking and has nothing to do with the reality or with different kinds of realities. The only thing that can save you is to look inside. And once you're finished with looking inside, you will realize that you're not alone and that we're all sitting in the same boat, and that real liberation can only happen if not only you but others also wake up. And this boat that we are sitting in is sinking. And the name of the boat is Agricultural Revolution. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you for watching and subscribing and hitting the bell button and joining us on Patreon or Facebook, and see you soon.